Thank you very much, Sabine, for this very kind and nice introduction and for hosting us this evening. I would also like to welcome all participants, though I can't really see you due, of course, to the fact that we are going digital, but please be welcome. I know that normally His Excellency Ambassador Frank Carouet, the Ambassador of Belgium in Rome, is present this evening. So thank you very much, Your Excellency, and I hope you will enjoy today's lectures. So today's presentations on Belgian diplomatic architecture are the outcome of the work of 4 persons. Professor Freddy Fleuret, PhD candidate Bram de Maeyer, PhD candidate Charlotte Rottiers, and myself, Professor Anne-Françoise Morel. Hence, in this introduction, I will give you a brief overview of the genesis of this collaboration and the research team, and I will also introduce the research fields and main research questions before giving the floor to Charlotte and Bram, who will each present a case study from their PhD research. In 2014, my colleague Freddy Fleuret and I embarked on the adventure of the study of Belgian embassy architecture. I consciously use the word adventure because until then, Freddy's research had mainly focused on domestic architecture and design in Belgium, and my study engaged primarily with politics of representation in early modern Stuart churches. However, during a presentation, Freddy announced she was developing a new research thread, the diplomacy of the interior, while I'll just returned from an internship at the Belgian embassy in Rabat under direction of Ambassador Frank Carouet. Hence, during the coffee break, we decided to explore the possibilities to study the architecture of the Belgian embassies around the world. To my surprise, there was little existing literature on the topic. The Federal Public Service Foreign Affairs published some beautiful booklets on some of the more peculiar embassy buildings, and you see some covers of these booklets on this slide. Former ambassadors and their partners ordered or published on the chancelleries and or residencies where they were posted. For instance, the book on Rome Vatican, and also the book on Warsaw. And of course, there is the famous and beautifully illustrated book of Olivier Stevens entitled Belgian Most Beautiful Embassies from Around the World. However, no complete inventory nor architectural historical overview of the Belgian embassies had been published so far. So a first important step in this new adventure consisted in the drawing up of a complete inventory of the chancelleries and residencies which were still in use in 2014, and also to gain insights in the workings of the office managing the foreign patrimony of the Federal Public Service Foreign Affairs. This resulted in a master thesis conducted by Emily Ampe, and in a document listing far more questions than answers. And this is always a good indication for an interesting research proposal. The fact that we were confronted with more questions than answers was not in the least driven by the extremely broad variety in architecture, which falls under the umbrella of Belgian diplomatic architecture. And I show you some examples on the slide. Here you see a picture of the Belgian consulate in Malena and the Belgian legation in Buenos Aires, two early examples of buildings constructed under the supervision of the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or both by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and representing an architecture which is rather typical for the early 20th century, mixing classical with some exotic elements. On the next slide, we see the Belgian residence in Moscow, which is still used as a Belgian residence in Moscow, and which is also an example of a monumental classical building. And on the last slide I want to show you now, you see three examples dating from after 1950. And there you really see that there is a broad variety in the architecture. And when we look at the example of Warsaw, we see what we could call a reconstruction à l'identique of a former hotel particulier, while more or less in the same time, the Belgian government also ordered a modernist building in Tokyo. And finally, we see the kind of architecture that is ordered and built today to serve as Belgian embassies, for instance, in Kinshasa, but also in Rabat. So a very extreme variety in architecture. So we continued our investigation in 2015 and 2016, and we came to a first conclusion that the variety in architecture and design and the quality of diplomatic architecture, as well as the absence of research on diplomatic architecture, is not so uncommon for middle power states as Belgium. This contrasts greatly with, for instance, the design and the study of embassies of world powers, for instance, the United States of America. Jane Loeffler's History of Embassy Architecture of the United States offers a thorough discussion on the building policy of the US, with particular attention for the decades after the Second World War, when the US invested in the construction of a series of modernist building projects in many different parts of the world. A special entity of the State Department, called the Foreign Building Office, the FBO, appointed an architectural advisory panel of prominent architects, which carefully selected progressive modern designs, which, and I quote, had to fit the local scene and be American, as well as, and I quote again, harmonize with the past and be new, unquote. 12 embassy and consulate office buildings were designed and constructed between 1954 and 1958, and you see some examples of them on this slide. And but as I stated before, this case is rather exceptional in as well the design as in the study of diplomatic architecture. In order to fill the above-mentioned research gap and to gain more knowledge on the Belgian diplomatic architecture and the role and importance of architecture in diplomacy of middle power states, we raised funds for two research projects. The first one focuses on Belgian purpose-built embassies after 1945, and the second one digs into the history of Belgian diplomatic architecture from the creation of the network of posts in 1831 until the outbreak of the Second World War. The case of Belgium is indeed a particularly interesting one. Firstly, Belgium is in the 19th century a new nation state surrounded by old powers. The creation of the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and ditto diplomatic network started soon after the independence of Belgium. While Belgian foreign politics were informed by the internationally imposed status of neutrality, the quest for a national identity was nevertheless important for the young state. It is thus interesting to see how neutrality and national identity were balanced and gradually evolved. Secondly, Belgium abandoned its policy of strict neutrality following the Second World War and fully embraced the multilateral and supranational world order as one of the founding members of the European Union. Hence, Charlotte's research focuses on the Belgian diplomatic, architectural and cultural patrimony assembled between the creation of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1831 and the outbreak of the Second World War. The 19th century marked the international start for the systematic establishment of the resident embassy. While in the first decades, diplomatic housing remained relegated to the diplomatic agent himself, governments gradually took over. Especially from the second half of the 19th century onwards, governmental real estate operations abroad became a consciously adopted representational strategy, eventually leading to the design and construction of the first purpose-built embassies in the early 20th century. And Charlotte will discuss such a case study in Asia with you later on this evening. So during this period, the diplomatic building gradually developed its threefold program of housing, administration, and representation, and became an instrument to establish political and economic legitimacy at home and abroad. Bram's project, on the other hand, focuses on the study of purpose-built embassies and the role of architectural design in the representation of a middle power country like Belgium after 1945. This chronological limitation is based on the profound impact of the Second World War on the world order, which among others triggered a shift in diplomacy from bilateralism towards multilateralism and international cooperation. Since the Second World War, many countries, and in particular middle powers, were confronted with the increasingly complex assignment of representation within a global context and international organization and alliances, such as the European Union, initiated as European Coal and Steel Community, and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This has stimulated them to develop representational strategies, not only taking into account bilateral relationships, but at the same time taking position in a global political and cultural arena. In today's presentation, we will thus offer you two case study analyses of Belgian diplomatic architecture. Charlotte will present the history of the creation of the legation and consulate buildings in Beijing and Seoul, which were both built by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs at the start of the 20th century as part of Leopold II's imperialistic ambitions and as part of the bureaucratization of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, while Bram will uncover the history of the genesis, the design, and construction of the Belgian Chancellery in Washington, D.C. between 1945 and 1957, within the context of the Transatlantic Alliance. Through these and other case studies, we hope to gain insight in our main research question, mainly to what extent architectural representation is part of the diplomatic agenda, and how architecture and interior decoration are given agency during diplomatic missions. We address this main question through several sub-questions. First of all, of course, we look at the way, we look at what kind of architecture the Belgian state built since the start of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the deployment of the diplomatic network in 1831. Secondly, we want to understand the role and the impact of the architect and the interior designer in the decision-making process. And what do they take into account when they design diplomatic architecture? But we also look at the user. What is the role of the diplomat, the ambassador in the decision-making process? And what are their concerns regarding diplomatic architecture? Also important is, of course, the policy of the Federal Public Service Foreign Affairs regarding diplomatic architecture. What is this policy? How does it evolve over time and history? And finally, how can the knowledge we develop in this study support the nation's and the ministry's policy in dealing with the diplomatic patrimony, which is an exceptional patrimony because it is national Belgian patrimony, but on foreign grounds. In order to tackle all these questions, we not only draw upon our two ongoing PhD projects, but we also explore other case studies and research topics with, for instance, master students in architecture at the KU Leuven. This year, two of them conduct a case study analysis on the Belgian diplomatic premises in Berlin and Canberra, and one of them takes the reverse point of view and studies the creation and evolution of Brussels as a modern international capital accommodating embassies. We also develop several national and international collaborations. Since 2016, we work closely together with the TU Eindhoven, where Helene Damen is conducting a similar PhD research on Dutch purpose-built embassies. Of course, we work closely together with the Federal Public Service Foreign Affairs. In spring 2020, we planned a symposium which aimed at bringing together the different stakeholders, the diplomats, the Federal Public Service Foreign Affairs, architects, designer, consultants, and so on, in a critical exchange of ideas on contemporary embassy architecture and on the role of architecture, design, and art in modern diplomacy. But this had to be postponed as so many events due to the sanitary crisis. Together with the Academia Belgica, we envisage the organization of an architectural history summer school. And the aim is to study the architecture of the Academia Belgica with special attention for its exceptional design assignment, which was strongly influenced by the cultural and political ties between Italy and Belgium during the interwar period. Indeed, from the onset, the building was conceived to promote the cultural, scientific, and artistic cooperation between Italy and Belgium, and to function as what I would call a cultural diplomacy hub of Belgium in Italy. In the near future, we hope to gather and share this information on all our ongoing projects and collaborations with you through our Research and Expertise Center under construction called DARC, Diplomatic Architecture Research Center. So now I close this introduction, which I hope gave you some insights in the birth and the genesis of this project and our growing research team. And I'm happy now to give the floor first to Charlotte Rottiers and then to Bram de Maeyer. Enjoy their lectures. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Anne-Françoise. So today I would like to present to you the lost heritage of Belgium's forgotten diplomatic premises in East Asia. As I embarked on this research project last year, my first question was, of course, when and where Belgium started to invest in a state-owned diplomatic patrimony. Did it first lease and then later on acquire buildings to serve as a diplomatic post? And when did the construction of the first purpose-built embassy take place? Did the Ministry of Foreign Affairs invest firstly in the capitals of the neighboring countries like Paris or London, for example, or were different strategies at play? To answer these questions and to reconstruct the diplomatic patrimony throughout time, I started with mapping the different case studies in leasing, acquiring, and building diplomatic premises abroad. In the first period of my research project between 1830 and the 1880s approximately, the ministry took its first steps in setting up its diplomatic network abroad and organizing its representation. There were no investments made by the ministry. The diplomats were responsible for finding and financing their own accommodation abroad. Throughout the decades, this led to an increasing demand of reimbursements and ad hoc expenses. The second period falls roughly together with the period of new imperialism and Leopold II's economy-oriented politics between the 1880s and the outbreak of the First World War. We can see in this period that the first state-financed acquisitions and constructions of diplomatic patrimony take place, and mostly all of them are located in faraway regions like East Asia, where there is a significant housing shortage and a high demand by the diplomats, which created the biggest need for long-term solutions and investments. The third and final period of my mapping, we can see that Belgium also started to invest in diplomatic premises in Europe and not solely in the more far away overseas regions. When looking at this initial mapping, it is striking that so many building projects are situated in East Asia, and not only legations, but also a significant amount of consulates. And this, of course, raises the question, why? Why was there such a need or a motivation to invest in a fixed diplomatic housing in East Asia? A central idea regarding diplomatic architecture is the assumption that diplomatic premises were designed to officially represent a nation abroad and to externalize the identity of the sending nation. But is it true that the representative purposes were the main motivation for switching to a ministry-regulated postal network? We can ask ourselves whether maybe financial or practical considerations played a bigger role in this initial phase. Since the first lease and the first construction projects take place in East Asia, it's only logical to focus on these cases and to find an answer to the question why Belgium started to invest in diplomatic real estate in the first place. Was it practicality or rather representation? When Belgium established its first diplomatic relations in the 1860s in China and sent its first envoy to Peking, some bigger powers like America, France, Great Britain, and Russia were already present in Peking. And their diplomats took up housing in what is now known as the legation quarter. This was an area in the city designed by the Qing government for foreign legations and would later on become a walled-off district in Peking. This legation quarter was approximately 3 kilometers long and 1.5 kilometers wide. The southern wall, here the southern wall was the Tatar wall and ringed the entire city of Peking, and the northern end led to the imperial city, to the seat of power. And for Westerners, this more closed off quarter was the ideal place to reside, and quickly a flourishing social life developed in this legation quarter. Belgium at this point didn't have any housing yet. The diplomat was responsible to find and finance his own housing in Peking, which was a difficult task because of the very limited real estate market and a shortage of residences that were up to par with the expectations of Western diplomats regarding comfort, hygiene, and climate robustness. The cost of living was also significantly higher, and the diplomats often took longer vacations to return home because the travel at that time took almost 2 months traveling from Belgium to Peking. And to make the posting in Peking a bit more attractive and the arrival of the diplomat more efficient, the ministry started looking for a fixed building to rent as a legation building. But the contacts and the experiences were very limited, but the ministry consulted a group of Westerners who were already active for quite a while in China, and that were the missionaries. They already built multiple churches, schools, and residential housing, and they had contact with the Lazarist mission in Peking, who owned a plot of land in the vicinity of the legation quarter. And here these missionaries would construct a legation building for Belgium in the 1870s. And this would then be rented out to Belgium on a trimestral basis. Here on the plan on the right side, you can see that there are 3 different courtyards in this legation building. This is the entrance, and here in the first courtyard are mostly storage rooms. The second courtyard gives the entrance to the apartments of the attaché and of the secretary. And then in the third main courtyard is the housing and offices located of the minister and his family, with also a small living room and a dining room. And what is very interesting is that the plan of this building is reminiscent of the traditional Chinese house. So this showcases that the Belgian missionaries actually learned a lot from the local building traditions, and they worked closely together with local builders and craftsmen to construct this building according to the local building customs. As this building was commissioned to provide a solution for practical considerations, it did indeed that. It was a very performative building and was regarded as a very comfortable legation building. However, the building was constructed by missionaries who, albeit having a similar background in and expectations towards housing, they did not have the experience or the insight in the specific needs of a legation building. And it was called the Nomadon Caliph, who was one of the first ministers residing in this legation, who pointed this out when he received this floor plan in preparation of his posting in Peking. And he was actually quite disappointed by the limited dimensions of the dining room and the living room. In his opinion, they were both too small to function as a proper reception area to host guests and parties. The rooms were each only 12 square meters big, and this shows the need for a very specific function of the legation building, that of a location for informal meetings and representation by the hosting diplomat. And this function would increase in importance throughout the years when more and more legations opened up in the legation quarter, and a very tight-knit community and busy social life developed in this legation quarter. The presence of these Western colonial empires in China was becoming really problematic over time. With the strengthening of Western imperial influences and economic interest, the Chinese government weakened. And in the late 1890s, right before the turn of the century, the local citizens started to protest and demand their own autonomy and sovereignty in political affairs and the safeguarding of their economic and cultural interests. The diplomats posted in Peking described these in their letters and how this resulted in a hostile atmosphere towards Westerners. They described different signs and plaques in the streets, asking the Westerners to return home and to give back the political autonomy to the Chinese government. The different missionaries and diplomats are alarmed and also attacked in the streets. For example, a couple of Belgian monks were beheaded in the Mongolian province near the turn of the century, and this caused, of course, an outcry in the Belgian media. Meanwhile, the staff of the legation also grew and had to be housed in different lodgings in different parts of the city. And with the fear of attacks growing, they rented a kind of bodyguards to move through the city, fearing for attacks. The then present diplomat Émile de Cartier de Marchenne left on holiday in spring 1900 when he thought that peace was restored in Peking, and his successor Maurice Joostens arrived. However, Cartier de Marchenne turned out to be very mistaken. It was not the end of the anti-Western protest, more the eye of the storm. Violence broke out in different cities, but most heavily in Peking and Shenzhen, and accounts by diplomats at the time show that the Western diplomats didn't expect the inevitable, actually. So they were really not as much in touch with the local reality and the threat as they thought they did. Starting from 20 June 1900, the legation quarter was besieged, and the Belgian diplomats had to flee the legation and take up refuge in the Austrian legation. From there on, so here we have the Belgian legation, and they flee first to the Austrian legation, but after a couple of days, they have to take up residence near the British and the French legation for their safety. After almost 2 months of being under siege in this legation quarter, international troops arrive to liberate the legation quarter. And when Maurice Joostens returns back to his legation, he only finds this big pile of rubble with the lonely Belgian flag waving on top of the former legation building. Joostens turned out to be quite a skillful negotiator, and he managed to gain considerable monetary reimbursement. Belgian concession in the port of Shenzhen was also allocated to Belgium, and they could also take up residence on a new plot of land inside the legation quarter this time, which is a significant upgrade from the previous location because it's more closely located to the other powers in Peking. And all these reimbursements were, of course, enabled by the presence of the international army that, even though when peace was restored, didn't leave China right away, but lingered to ensure uneven negotiations and demands that would weaken China only further and didn't solve the conflict at the time. I will now mostly focus on the logic and try to reconstruct reasoning by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that would lead up to this first purpose-built legation building. As the Belgian government was allocated a building plot inside the legation quarter this time, they could design their own building from scratch. And the practical reasons I discussed earlier were still very important factors, and even more so because the staff only grew throughout the years, but a new consideration came into play: safety. And not only does Belgium move into the walled quarter, they would also design a compound. So they would build walls inside of walls, a kind of reversed prison to keep the community safe inside and to keep the possible hostile citizens of Peking outside. The main element inside this compound was the residence, which you can see here, which was designed in a neo-Flemish Renaissance style. And this is where the head of the mission had its private chambers, but also his office spaces. Now, the ministry had more experience and the opportunity to design the legation, resulting in more spacious public rooms to host parties and to entertain guests, solving the initial shortcomings of the first legation building. And this would allow the Belgian diplomats to fully integrate in the social life of the legation quarter and to do their job to the fullest. When looking at the entire compound complex, we can see first the gate, which gives the entrance to the compound. Centrally located is the residence, which you can also see here in the end of the photo. Furthermore, there are 4 different pavilions constructed at the compound. There is, and they both have the lodgings and offices combined inside of them. There is one for the advisor, there is one for the consul, one for the chancellery, and then one for the commander of the honorary guard. And this was indeed a new element of the legation building. As a result of the Boxer uprising, the foreign powers were allowed to host a small army inside the legation quarter to protect themselves for possible further attacks. In the following decades, minor upgrades were carried out in order to keep the quality of living in the compounds. However, the consideration of safety and military protection stayed important, and it was a wish of Leopold II and high-ranking officials to have a military presence in China parallel to the other powers. When in 1930 the German diplomats were expelled from the legation quarter, Belgium managed to annex the adjacent plot. This used to be the barracks of the German legation, which was to the left of Belgium, but this was annexed by the Belgian legation, making a considerable enlargement of their legation. Here you can see as well on the map the new plot that was added to the Belgian legation. After the Second World War, some sanitary facilities were added to the compound to keep the level of comfort and hygiene up to par with the living conditions back home. Showers and toilets with a flush were installed. Here is a drawing of the showers that were added to the barracks. And here you can see a drawing of the toilets with the flush system. And this seems like a trivial fact, but actually is quite important because this shows that this kind of technology didn't exist in China and was imported by the foreign population living in China. Also, heating, electricity, and later on telephone lines were added and all paid for by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And while these buildings were mostly constructed from a concern of practicality, we can see that representation is playing a bigger role in comparison with the previous legation building. There were bigger public rooms, and Belgium seemed to have played an important part in the social life in the legation quarter, hosting many parties, movie screenings, receptions, etc. When looking at the consulate in Shenzhen, which was granted as a concession to Belgium in 1901, we can see that also safety and protection was a very important element when designing the consulate building. The concession that was handed to Belgium had already existing housing of some 1,600 Chinese citizens, and because of the pressure of the Chinese government to develop the concessions, the ministry started thinking in 1907 about accommodating the government, the council in fixed premises, just like in Peking. There were two options available. They could buy or rent an existing building in the German concession, or they could build their own consulate in the Belgian concession, which was an interesting option, but there was a mobility problem at the time. It was less accessible by boat or by train in comparison with the German concession, and they envisioned that this problem with accessibility would only be solved in the next couple of years. This was not very certain at the time. In the end, they decided to design and construct their own consulate, and here there's an interesting quote in the correspondence between the ministry and the consuls in Shenzhen. The deciding argument was that having their own seat of power in the concession would send a message to the local Chinese citizens that were under Belgian command. And this would needed to be done before they would become, as I quote, unable to be governed. So the building had to inspire or command respect for the Belgian presence and keep local citizens in line by portraying power via diplomatic architecture. And this is very much in line with the showcasing of military power in Peking. What is very striking about the construction activity in East Asia is that several consulates were built. And whereas initially one would think that the legations were the priority of investments, these consulates play a more important role and show Belgium's real priority, the economic interest in East Asia. And these interests were also the direct reason for the construction of the consulate in Seoul. When Korea becomes an independent, neutral state at the turn of the century, they signed a friendship treaty with Belgium, which is also, of course, a neutral country at the time, and they would have a special place for Belgium in their international policy, and Belgium is granted certain advantages in Korea. And this friendship treaty led to the preparations and the construction of a consulate, which was completed in 1907. And for this building, they worked closely together with the Ministry of Public Works in Belgium, and they designed the building from Brussels, and crates with building materials were shipped from Antwerp to Seoul to be constructed at the site. Here you can see the main entrance. The building is built in a neoclassical style. And however interesting, the history of this consulate is quite short. Representation was also very important in this building, as Belgium tried to represent itself as a good business partner for Korean industrialists and investors. They united the triple function of administration, housing, and representation in this building, and they tried to solve previous problems like in the first Peking legation building by combining these three functions in this consulate design. On the right side of the ground level, we can see all the administrative functions like the offices, the archive, the chancellery, and on the left side, representation is fully integrated with plenty of space to host receptions and parties for guests. On the second floor, all the lodgings were located. But despite the beautiful facade and the neoclassicist design, there were some shortcomings with the building. And it is Bribosia, the second and the last consulate would inhabit this building, complains about the design. In his opinion, the orientation was completely wrong. The way that the floor plan was designed didn't function in the local climate of Seoul. He wrote, and I quote, that it is the monument to the pretense and the stupidity of the Belgians. The building was not adapted at all, it was unlivable in the winter and too hot in the summer. And the consul actually asked to be allowed to stay in a hotel in the winter, which was of course totally against the original purpose and the effort of the ministry to avoid extra cost and to enable the consul to stay in a comfortable building of his own. So while initially considerations of practicality urged the ministry to invest in diplomatic premises in the faraway regions like East Asia, they gained experience throughout the different building projects, and parallel to other nations present in East Asia, the representation would actually become more and more important. Delegation and the consulate both take on the role of housing, administration and representation, and building on the experience, Belgium will start to invest more and more in comfortable and distinguished interior decoration as well, to make kind of a perfect decor for the diplomatic activities. So while the initial reasons for investing were those of practicality, representation would become intrinsically linked with the design of diplomatic architecture. As kind of a short epilogue, I would like to reflect on the elements of representation and the import of Western neo-styles and how these imperial and colonial layers of meaning can be translated into our contemporary society, because both the residents in Peking and Seoul have been preserved, but not as a diplomatic premise. They have been transformed to serve new functions. But we can ask ourselves, to what extent is the Belgian identity and these elements of representation still present in the buildings today? So here we see the Belgian residence in Peking, which was described as one of the most beautiful legation buildings in the eyes of the imperial powers in China. It was a safe walled compound in the middle of busy Peking, and now it's transformed to a high-end hotel in walking distance from the Forbidden City. So the hotel is quite exclusive, and the setting and location contribute to a feeling of seclusion of the rest of the city. And it's been used mostly by the Chinese political elite as an exclusive retreat. And we can question in the impact of the architectural style of the residence, which is built in Neo-Flemish Renaissance style and really linked to the Belgian national architecture and identity. And we can question if this identity is still recognized today as such, as a Belgian identity by the local citizens and the hotel guests, or is it rather perceived as the style of a foreign and invading power, an unwelcome element in the cityscape? We can question how far the legation really embodied a Belgian identity, or did it rather communicate a we versus them message? And are these layers of meaning still, and these layers of separation still function in its present function as a hotel, but then in a new political context? When looking at the consulate in Seoul, it had a very short history because Korea was again annexed by Japan, and in 1918 it was sold to the Japanese government. In 1977 it gets the heritage status, and it is totally dismantled and moved to a new location in the south of Seoul to save it from demolishing in a big urban renewal project. It is now a museum. It's part of the Sema Museum in the south of Seoul. And there were plans to establish a banking museum, but now it's an art museum. And inside the building, there is still one room dedicated to this history of the Belgian diplomatic presence and architectural prestigious project that this was envisaged to be in the museum. And actually Brubosia, in his complaint to the ministry, already said that the building was not fit to be a consular building. It would better serve its purpose as a museum building. And he is right, it's a museum now. And I think it is a very interesting reminder of the Belgian presence in Korea. Thank you.
Thank you, Charlotte, for the wonderful presentation. My presentation of today sheds light on the first major building project launched by the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs in the post-war period. This building activity comprised of constructing a chancery, and a chancery, that's the office section of an embassy. In Washington, D.C., during the heydays of the transatlantic alliance between Belgium and the United States. I want to start off this case study with an observation. On the 9th of February 1957, the Belgian Foreign Minister Paul-Henri Spaak inaugurated the recently completed Belgian Chancery by giving a speech to the attending members of Washington's Corps Diplomatique and officials of the US State Department, the American Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In this speech, the socialist heavyweight indicated that he played a significant role in commissioning this building project. And he said that it served as a token of recognition for America's leading role in the world at the time. Furthermore, Minister Spaak made the case that the Belgian Foreign Ministry purposefully opted for an architectural design that blended into the architectural landscape of Washington, D.C. Judging by the comments made by Spaak, the attending political dignitaries could have easily get the impression that the new Belgian embassy offices were the result of a closely monitored and guided building policy put in place by the Belgian Foreign Ministry. This presentation, however, sets out to uncover to what extent Minister Spaak actually practiced what he preached back in 1957. It is, of course, one thing to solemnly state as foreign minister that one personally invests in embassy architecture as a means to cement the transatlantic alliance, but quite a different matter to actually put such ambitions into practice. Therefore, this case study questions whether the Belgian Foreign Ministry indeed projected political messages on this new diplomatic building, and if so, how this was translated into the new chancery in terms of architecture, interior design, and artwork. In order to answer the main research question, this presentation approaches the Belgian diplomatic building project from three distinct perspectives. The first perspective examines the ministry's inner workings towards commissioning this new chancery by highlighting the incentives to build a new chancery and key players involved in greenlighting its construction. Building on this bureaucratic foundation, the second perspective discusses the chancery's architectural features by emphasizing representational elements incorporated into the design. Were the architects involved giving carte blanche in designing the new chancery, or did they take their cues from ministry officials working in Brussels? And furthermore, what kind of architecture was deemed as appropriate to represent the Belgian state on American soil, and to what extent did this design resonate any political messages? The third and final perspective sheds light on the chancery as diplomatic work environment. What kind of office space planning did the architects involved have in store for Belgian diplomatic staff in Washington, D.C.? And did this spatial layout reflect any fundamental changes affecting Belgian diplomatic practice at the time? Building on the growing interests of historians to analyze the material culture of diplomatic agents, this part also examines whether the new chancery was used as a venue for cultural diplomacy. More specifically, did the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs consciously opt to include Belgian-made furniture and artwork in the chancery's interiors to showcase national craftsmanship abroad? Let us first shed light on the incentives and the decision-making process. Following the Second World War, the foreign policy of Belgium profoundly changed. The country's neutrality status was abandoned, and Belgian foreign policymakers fully embraced the supra- and international world order shaping the post-war period. Whereas Belgium and Minister Spaak in particular initially did not consider the USA to be a key partner, Belgium increasingly allied itself with the United States from 1947 onwards in order to facilitate the political and economic integration of Western Europe. This resulted in signing the Marshall Plan in 1947, the NATO Treaty in 1949, and also joining the American-led coalition during the Korean War. A pivotal figure overseeing this shift towards the USA was Baron Robert Zilverkruis. Serving as Belgian ambassador in Washington, D.C. from 1945 until 1959, Zilverkruis was a strong sympathizer of the USA and spared no expense to cement bilateral ties. On the left-hand side, for instance, you can see Ambassador Zilverkruis handing over an ornamental box to President Harry Truman, which contained dirt from Bastogne as a gift for America's involvement during the Ardennes Offensive of 1944. The growing importance of Washington, D.C. in Belgian foreign policy was clearly reflected in the size of the diplomatic staff. Whereas the embassy staff numbered just 7 persons in 1939, this number increased to 17 by 1950. In addition to a growing number of diplomats, attachés belonging to other Belgian ministries, such as the Ministry of Agriculture, Defense and Colonial Affairs, were also sent to the Belgian embassy to represent their ministries. The offices of the Belgian diplomats and attachés were accommodated in a freestanding federal-style townhouse, which was bought in 1945. Based on the classical principles of Greek and Roman architecture, federal-style architecture formed the American adaptation of Georgian architecture of Great Britain. Labeled as the country's first national architecture, this style was immensely popular in the late 17th and early 19th century and witnessed several revivals. A typical federal-style townhouse, such as the Belgian Chancery, comprised of a low-rise rectangular structure with a pitched roof. The facade usually featured an arrangement of bricks with each row laid in alternating headers and stretchers, the so-called Flemish bond, and also mediocre window frames. The Belgian Chancery was situated at 22nd Street in close proximity to Massachusetts Avenue. Along this main avenue, the majority of diplomatic missions was located, earning this street the nickname Embassy Row. Ambassador Zilverkruis, however, was not pleased with the working conditions in the Chancery, arguing that the offices were too cramped. During the summer of 1945, the Baron personally carried out alteration works, but he indicated that these works were only just sufficient to keep his bureaucratic engine running. Zilverkruis thus conceived the idea to build a new chancery and reached out to Minister Spaak to greenlight such a building project. Minister Spaak was not opposed to this plan, but he tasked Ambassador Zilverkruis to first scan the local real estate market for a suitable building plot. In April 1947, Zilverkruis sent a detailed report to Mr. Spaak, urging him to purchase a building plot situated just north of Embassy Row. Reminiscent of present-day real estate agents, Zilverkruis accentuated to Minister Spaak the plot's prominent location, immersed in a residential and wooded neighborhood near Rock Creek Park. He also highlighted how the plot was situated opposite to Washington National Cathedral and in close proximity to the British Embassy, 2 landmarks of the American capital at the time. As such, it seems Zilverkruis opted for this prominent location to increase Belgium's visibility and thus its prestige in the contemporary Caput Mundi of the time. Well aware that the Ministry of Finance would have the final say in purchasing the plot of land, the ambassador also emphasized the building's plot's reasonable price tag of $21,000. The purchase of the building plot was eventually greenlighted by Minister Spaak in May 1947. Notwithstanding the purchase of this building plot, Secretary General Hervé de Gruben, at the time the ministry's highest official, strongly opposed these building plans, arguing these would be far too expensive. Confronted with internal opposition at the ministry, Ambassador Zilverkruis started off an intensive lobbying campaign by reaching out to his political friends in Brussels to secure the necessary funding to construct a new chancery. These included political heavyweights such as Gaston Askins, the Christian Democratic Minister of Finance, and Maurice Frère, the governor of the National Bank, who both expressed their support to Ambassador Zilverkruis. It is interesting to note that Minister Askins indicated how Spaak wanted to put the building plans on hold. It was only in 1954, when Spaak was no longer foreign minister, that the Christian Democratic government Van Houten allocated $1 million to the project, indicating that the ambassador's close ties with high-ranking members of the Christian Social Party paid off in the long run. As such, Foreign Minister Spaak did not play a significant role in greenlighting the Chancellery's construction. Let us now turn to the design of the new Belgian Chancellery. In addition to securing the necessary funding, Ambassador Zilverkruis also took it upon himself to find an architect. He reached out to the Belgian architect Hugo van Kuik, who was closely affiliated to the United States. In the 1930s, for instance, he gave a series of courses on architecture and urbanism at Yale University. During the Second World War, van Kuik enlisted in the US Army as engineer, playing a pivotal role in planning the D-Day landings. Following the end of the war, van Kuik was also an associate architect at the New York-based architectural office Voorhees, Walker, Smith & Smith, which facilitated his involvement in designing the Belgian Chancellery on American soil. At the time, Hugo van Kuik was primarily known for his high-rise social housing projects in Antwerp in the Luchtbouw neighborhood, comprising of a series of prefabricated housing blocks and towers. In addition, he also made a name for himself by designing major commercial office towers in Belgium. The insurance company Prévoyance Sociale hired the Belgian architect to design a skyscraper, at the time a novelty in the skyline of Brussels, to accommodate its new head office. Completed in 1957, Van Kuik's skyscraper formed a locally embedded approach to American corporate modernism, characterized by repetitive modular forms and a prominent display of modern building materials such as steel, concrete, and a glassed facade. With regard to the Chancellery's design, no correspondence has been found that indicates that the Belgian Foreign Ministry gave any cues to the architects on the Chancellery's design. As the search for the building plot and the architect was already outsourced to Ambassador Zilverkruis, one can assume that the Belgian Foreign Ministry was not very interested in embassy architecture at the time and gave the architects involved carte blanche. The architects designed a crescent-shaped two-story building with a pitched roof and to a large extent symmetrical composition. The building was covered in limestone and its front facade was characterized by a centrally positioned entrance flanked by a repetitive fenestration pattern. Opting for an architectural design that blended in with Washington's neoclassical government buildings at the time, the architects chose for a stripped classicist design, which formed a modern derivation of Greco-Roman architecture, which left out most ornamentation. The stripped classicist design for the Washington Chancellery intertwined classical vocabulary, such as pillars and white marble walls at the main entrance, with modern building elements, such as a fully glassed revolving door. The Chancellery's facade was covered by the highly popular Indiana limestone, which was arranged in a square pattern, accentuating the strong horizontality of the building. To accentuate the importance of the political section, the windows of the first floor were accentuated in height to lend more dignity to the embassy offices from where Ambassador Zilverkruis and his fellow diplomats were working. Above the main entrance of the Chancellery, a large Belgian coat of arms was strategically sculpted into the facade, which served as a clear marker of Belgian identity on American soil. The incorporation of such an explicit national reference was highly unusual in Belgian embassy architecture at the time. In the case of the Belgian purpose-built Chancellery in Canberra, Australia, which was completed in 1961, such elements of national representation were lacking in design. Only the Belgian flag and a small coat of arms mounted on the building's exteriors expressed Belgian identity on Australian soil. Upon entering the Chancery in Washington, D.C. through the revolving doors, the visitors entered the grand lobby with its high ceiling, giving an additional effect of space and light. At the back of the lobby, the architects opted for a spiral staircase, functioning as a dynamic feature, which led to the offices of Zilverkruis and his diplomats. Strategically opting for national applied materials in the most public area of the building, the lobby's stair steps and pillars were covered with Belgian black marble, more commonly known as the Noir Belge, which could be found in the quarries of Namur. The lobby's concrete walls were covered by plywood panels made of the limba tree, which originated from the Belgian Congo. Ironically, the Congo gained its independence in 1960, just 3 years following the Chancery's completion, which turned the limba wood in the lobby area into a relic of the past overnight. As one can see on this image of the Bidens visiting the Belgian Chancery in the wake of the terrorist attacks on Brussels of March 2016, you can see that the architects also made an inscription in the lobby area. Somewhat echoing Roman inscriptions of antiquity, the inscription in the Chancery's lobby indicated that the building was erected in the 5th year of King Baudouin's reign and highlighted key players involved in this building project, such as Zilverkruis, the architects, and the building contractor. The third and final perspective examines the Chancery as diplomatic work environment and its material culture. The spatial layout of the embassy offices clearly reflects the pecking order within the Belgian embassy at the time. The offices of the senior Belgian diplomats, which are marked in blue, were clustered together in the northern end of the corridor. Ambassador Zilverkruis was given the largest individual office, which also comprised of a private toilet, a private dressing room, and 2 balconies. In contrast, the offices of junior diplomats and attachés working for other government departments such as agriculture, colonial affairs, and the Ministry of Defense, marked in red, they were given much smaller offices, illustrating their lower rank within the pecking order at the embassy. As part of his agenda to promote Belgian craftsmanship in the United States during his ambassadorship, Ambassador Zilverkruis reached out to the Belgian furniture manufacturer De Koene to produce office furniture for the new Belgian Chancery. In the mid-1950s, De Koene was one of the leading Belgian companies in the furniture and wood industry, which was crystallized by a thorough reorientation of its commercial activities at the time. De Koene's furniture department obtained a license in 1954 to produce and sell furniture of Knoll, one of the leading American furniture brands producing modern domestic and office furniture by esteemed designers such as Eero Saarinen and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. In the case of the Washington Chancery, however, Ambassador Zilverkruis ignored the innovative Knoll designs produced by De Koene and instead opted for a conservative approach, as he selected De Koene's segment of period furniture to correspond with the stripped classicist architecture of the Chancery building. Echoing the Baron's preference for French period styles, the ambassador selected De Koene's line of neo-empire furniture. De Koene also produced decorative elements for the personal office of Ambassador Zilverkruis. Strategically flanking the ambassador's wooden desk, 2 wooden sockles served as flagpoles for the Belgian tricolor. The top of the flagpole on the left-hand side comprised of a carved lion, a traditional emblem of the Belgian state. Above the personal desk of Zilverkruis, a state portrait of the Belgian King Baudouin was placed, suggesting that the King of the Belgians was constantly looking over the shoulder of his diplomatic representative in Washington, D.C. Continuing along these lines to accentuate Belgian craftsmanship in the Chancery's interiors, Zilverkruis installed a Belgian-made tapestry in the lobby area. Designed by the Belgian painter Floris Jespers, this tapestry was initially produced to decorate the Belgian National Pavilion at the New York World's Fair of 1939. Titled The Work of Missionaries in the United States, the tapestry depicts the Roman Catholic priest Louis Hennepin, who left his home province of Hainaut in present-day Belgium at the end of the 17th century to travel to the New World to explore the Mississippi region and also to spread Christianity. This artwork is a textbook example of cultural diplomacy, as it does not only showcase Belgian craftsmanship, but also resonates strong political messages by depicting a romanticized common history between Belgium and the United States, with Christianity as a uniting factor between both countries. As this presentation has illustrated, it was Ambassador Zilverkruis who was the driving force behind the Chancery's construction, as he conceived not only the idea to construct a new Chancery, but he also personally selected a building plot. He also personally reached out to an architect, and he also raised the necessary funding in Brussels by reaching out to his political allies. Minister Spaak, on the other hand, only played a minor role in the construction of the embassy. One can only wonder what went through the mind of Ambassador Zilverkruis, as Foreign Minister Spaak took credit for the new Chancery in his inauguration speech in February 1957. Filling up the void left by the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it were the architects involved which approached this commission as a way to pay tribute to Belgium and the United States by means of architecture. Whereas its stripped classicist exteriors pay tribute to Washington's government architecture, the sculpted coat of arms and the Chancery's interiors accentuated Belgium's diplomatic presence by means of applied materials originating from Belgium and the Belgian Congo. Seeing his new embassy offices to be more than just a new work environment, the senior diplomat also used his new Chancery as a venue for cultural diplomacy by showcasing Belgian-made office furniture and artwork which resonated strong political messages. As such, it was first and foremost the merits of Ambassador Zilverkruis that the new Belgian Chancery in the American capital was approached as an opportunity to cement the transatlantic alliance by means of architecture, interior design, and artwork. In December 2019, however, the architectural legacy of Ambassador Zilverkruis' ambassadorship to the United States lost its prominent place in the diplomatic patrimony of the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. According to Foreign Minister Didier Reynders, the Chancery building had become too spacious and decided to relocate the embassy offices to an apartment building in Washington, D.C. The Chancery was sold to the Vietnamese government for $23 million. It is somewhat ironic that the building, which expressed Belgium's commitment to the United States in the context of the Cold War, has been sold to one of the last communist regimes in the world. Whereas Belgian media have primarily labeled the Chancery sale as yet another effort to balance the derailed federal budget, this move may also be an indication of the diminishing importance of the transatlantic alliance in the current state of international affairs. That was my presentation. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you very much, Bram and Charlotte, for this very interesting talk. As I have announced on the chat a few minutes before, you will be able to ask the speakers some questions. If you could send us a chat, and I will activate your microphone. Thank you. 2 minutes, because I think Therese is not being able to send us. You were applauding. Okay. So thank you, Therese, for the very positive reaction. If there's somebody else who wants to ask a question, you can just send us a text. I'm sure that someone will have a question. I'm not sure if anyone can hear us. I don't know if Anne-Françoise Morel or Bram or Charlotte or Ans wants to say something, or the director. Ah, I have someone who has a question. Just a minute. It's Wojtek. Okay. There you go.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a question because you mentioned the cost of like that the buildings of the embassies were sold because, as far as I understood, the cost of maintenance was too high. Do you have knowledge like whether in general, like what's the cost of like the maintenance of the embassies so that the buildings just the cost of the maintenance of the embassies? Yeah.
It's in first of all, thank you for your question. It's quite difficult to give a sort of a general overview of maintenance, because it also depends on the local conditions within the receiving state. For instance, I have had many talks with the ministry's real estate department, and they say, for instance, what we can do with 100,000 euros in for instance, a country such as India, New Delhi, with that kind of a budget, we can only do a fraction, for instance, what we want to do in Washington, D.C. So regarding maintenance, that's also not really what my research is really focused on. It's more whenever it pops up for any reasons for selling something or for moving to a new premises, then I usually discuss it. But it's also interesting to see, for instance, that I haven't talked about it in my presentation because I wanted to keep within the 20 minutes. But in the case of Washington, D.C., they also sold the former federal-style Chancery building to the Dominican Republic. So the embassy is now housed there. But they used the money that they got from selling this property to partially finance the construction of the new Chancery. And that's actually because the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs doesn't really have at the time, nowadays it's changed, but at the time they didn't have a structural budget to construct something. So whenever they wanted to construct something, they really had to reach out to the Ministry of Finance, and it was always intensive discussions, to put it mildly, and so they used parts of their patrimony to finance construction of other things. I hope this somewhat answers the question that you had.
Thank you, Bram. Is there anybody else who would like to? I have Carlo Barbieri. Just an instant, I will. There you go. Carlo, now you should be able to reactivate your microphone.
Well, hello, good afternoon. I was just, it was very interesting listening to the different speeches and description of what happened in different countries in constructing buildings of Belgian diplomatic missions. I'm wonder how, from an architectural point of view, is it possible to cover, as I wrote my question, how is it possible to cover two different goals? From one side, the diplomatic mission should represent the interests of the own country abroad. This is one aspect. So, for instance, in also trying to promote the culture by the construction, the furniture, and so on. On the other side, how is it possible in covering the goal of facilitating and developing bilateral relations, in a sense that if you build and import furniture from abroad. And it was, for instance, the example in, if I understood correctly, in Korea, where the construction was completely different from the construction around. So it was a sort of cultural invasion, let's say so, all right? So how is it possible to cover these two different goals from an architectural point of view? This is a little bit the question. Thank you very much.
I don't know whether Bram or Charlotte would like to answer. But from the case studies we've studied so far, we can see that there are different strategies at work, and of course these strategies differ from one period from another. So the case Charlotte was presenting is a case in an old colonial tradition within the imperialistic policies of Leopold II. And there the primarily idea is really like to represent Belgium in full force, I can say. And but when we look at other projects, certainly those after the Second World War, and I think Bram can more expand on that one, we see that in some cases there was a real partnership between Belgium as a sending state and the receiving state, hosting the Belgian embassy or consulate, where Belgium can work together with the local architects, but then in dialogue sometimes as well with the Belgian government, and where different architectural traditions come together. It's also important to sometimes make a distinction between the interior and architecture and the exterior architecture, because of course an embassy or a consulate function on different layers. There is some part of the building that is really public, then you have some semi-public parts, and then the more private parts where only diplomats come. So, and taking into account these layers, the way the projects come into being, whether it is on demand of the receiving state or the sending state, the choice of the architect, and so on, you get different stories of these exchanges. And also the reading and the perception of one and the same building may of course differ from one culture to another. One of the cases Bram is working on, and I'm sorry Bram if now I dig into your research, but is for instance the Belgian compound in New Delhi, which is a very peculiar architecture, but using red bricks. And the red bricks are always interpreted by Belgian diplomats and in Belgium as being typically for a Belgian architecture, while when we dig into the archives, we also see that the use of the red brick is something typical from the tradition of the Indian architect Satish Gujral in the tradition he worked. So it is about dialogue actually, and how far you want to go or not to go in that dialogue. And this dialogue is also very dependent on the current political and diplomatic situation of that moment. And of course, yes, there is an evolution in the interpretation also during history. And I think it's very interesting also to see how one and the same object can have been designed bearing one or a specific message in mind, and how this leads its own life then over time. I don't know whether Charlotte or Bram would like to add something to that, or if you have further questions. Thank you. Yes, sure.
Yes. So this is a general question because this was mentioned in all the presentations. You mentioned how all those embassies and diplomatic buildings were later on sold to different states. and the embassies have the extraterritorial status. So when I wanted to ask how easy or how difficult it is to change the status of the ground, and whether this question actually is a matter of discussion during the sale.
Well, so far as we see from the case studies that we study, of course, one thing is to see, you first have to know what the ownership is, because in some cases the plot of land is still in the ownership of the host country, while Belgium only owns the building. So this has then to be taken into consideration. But the details of this real estate operations are not are not really part of our research. But what for us is interesting is to see who owns the plot of land. Does Belgium buy it? Does Belgium rent it? Sometimes it's rented for like 100 years for a symbolic euro. And so on. So these are the complexities that actually have to be taken into account. What's also very important, and this also answers part of your previous question, is that when the Ministry of Foreign Affairs decides to sell one of its buildings, the money doesn't goes back to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It goes back to the federal government. So it's not that. So it's indeed, as you point at in your question, it's indeed a very complex situation with different partners, but I think what for us is the most important is what happens to the architecture, what happens to this monumental sculpture in the facade of the Belgian Chancellery in Washington DC after it has been sold to the Vietnamese. And I think, Bram, you can maybe tell us a bit about that, because if I remember well, you had a small anecdote on that ornamental sculpture.
Indeed, so the large sculpture of the Belgian coat of arms, the Belgian ambassador at the time, dedicato, he personally ensured that that sculpted coat of arms was transported to the garden of the residence. So the chancellery residence were situated in two different parts of the city, and so actually a small piece of the architectural legacy of Ambassador Zilverkruis is still in the possession of Belgium, fortunately, yes. But if you're at the beginning of your question, you mentioned the concept of extraterritoriality, if I'm correct. With that, it's actually from my reading, it's actually some kind of a misconception that, for instance, the plot of land of the Belgian Chancellery is part of Belgium. Is Belgian soil, but is Belgian soil, but that's actually not the case. It's true that the police or someone else cannot enter the premises unless they have the written permission of the serving diplomat at the time to actually enter the premises. That's with the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations of 1961 that there was finally a legal framework, because there was an increase of different countries. New countries became independent, and they wanted to create some kind of legal framework to ensure diplomatic relations would run smoothly.
Okay.
And maybe also like a small anecdote for Seoul. There, the building was also sold in 1918 to the Japanese government, and there is very clear the plot of land was bought by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So the building contract is preserved in the current embassy. And when the Japanese government bought it from Belgium, they had two very specific demands. The coat of arms in the main facade had to be removed. What happened to it didn't we don't know yet. And also the flagpole that was constructed in the garden also had to be taken down because they feared it might blow over and cause damages in storms. So also again, this coat of arms, this one piece of very Belgian identity had to be removed when it was sold to a different government.
Oké, dank u Charlotte. Ik geef nog eventjes het woord aan Françoise Morel en misschien Freddy Follet om een afsluitend woordje te doen.
Well, thank you very much again for hosting us in this very interesting series of lectures. And as you see, the use of the word adventure that I used in my introduction, I think it's a very good word, because it is a big adventure to reconstruct that history, but it's also a very interesting and fascinating history. And it's not only a history, it's also actuality and the future, because we are convinced that architecture and furniture are even in a digital world still important part of the diplomatic context, the diplomatic agency, and I think one of our missions is also to continue to raise attention not only to the economical point of view of embassy architecture, which can be very lucrative because some of our residencies and chancelleries are located in some very interesting real estate spots, but we also I think have to take into account the idea of representation, of daily functioning of these embassies in order to continue this strong diplomatic tradition that has been established since 1831 by the Belgian government, by the royalty, but also by our diplomats. And so I hope that this little part of this story that we presented to you today have raised your awareness about this yet unknown Belgian patrimony abroad. And it's actually kind of the same exercise we want to do with the Academia Belgica, show the exceptionality of the built architecture, not only the outside architecture, but also the inside furniture and design, because there is always also a dialogue between interior, exterior, and how they function together in this representational strategy. So thank you very much. I don't know whether Freddy wants to add something.
I think you summed up really well. I also want to thank the Academia Belgica from my part for giving us the floor to share our research on this topic. So thank you very much.
And I hope we can then also, once our website is online, use the channels of the Academia Belgica again, of course, to announce the official launch of our website, where you will be able to follow on a daily basis our research and the activities of our research center, which will mainly focus on Belgium, but not only, because the questions we as Belgian ask on Belgian architecture, diplomatic architecture, are also interesting, I think, for many other countries. So thank you very much.